In 476 AD, a Roman emperor was deposed. Everyone calls this the fall of Rome. But Rome had already been dead for 200 years. Nobody noticed. The textbooks give you a clean story: barbarians, collapsing borders, the end of an empire, simple, satisfying, wrong. It's wrong, not in every detail, but in the most important one. The barbarians didn't destroy Rome. They moved into a building that had already collapsed. The real question, the one nobody asks, is what brought the building down in the first place? What actually destroyed Rome started somewhere nobody was looking, and it was already irreversible before the first barbarian crossed a single border. In 60 AD, a Roman denarius, the standard coin of the empire, was approximately 90% silver. It had real value. Soldiers were paid in it. Taxes were collected in it. Trade across 3 continents depended on it. By 260 AD, 2 centuries later, that same coin contained less than 2% silver. The rest was bronze and copper, coated in a thin layer of silver wash that wore off within months of use. Imagine your salary being cut by 98% over 2 centuries. Not in one announcement, not with a press conference or a policy change. Quietly, coin by coin, year by year, until the money in your hand was worth almost nothing, and you had no way to prove it had ever been worth more. The people who noticed first were the soldiers. The Roman army had always been expensive. Legions required pay, food, equipment, and the promise of land after service. For centuries, the empire could afford this. Then it couldn't. When the currency collapsed, the soldiers' pay collapsed with it. A denarius that bought a week's provisions in 100 AD bought almost nothing by 250 AD. Generals who wanted loyalty from their troops began paying them in goods, food, livestock, land, instead of coins. But goods could only be sourced locally, which meant the army was no longer loyal to Rome. It was loyal to whoever controlled the local supply. This is how you lose an army without losing the battle. To pay for the army, even in devalued currency, the emperors needed more money, so they raised taxes. They raised them on merchants, on landowners, on farmers, on craftsmen, on anyone who produced anything of value. The result was predictable. The people being taxed produced less. Why invest in expanding a farm or a workshop if the state would take most of what you earned? Production slowed. The tax base shrank. And when the tax base shrank, the emperors raised taxes again. This spiral, tax more, produce less, tax more again, appears in the collapse of every major economic system in history. Rome did not invent it. Rome simply could not escape it. By 300 AD, Rome's economic structure was effectively gone. The currency was worthless. The army was fragmented. The middle class had been taxed into poverty. What remained was the appearance of an empire, the name, the titles, the ceremonies, built on a foundation that no longer existed. But there was a second force at work during this same period, one that is even less discussed, and in some ways, more destructive. Between 235 and 284 AD, a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire had 26 emperors. That is one new ruler every 23 months on average. Most of them did not die of old age. Most of them were murdered, not by foreign enemies, not by barbarians crossing the border, by their own soldiers, by their own generals, by the men who had sworn loyalty to them.
In half a century, the most powerful political office in the Western world became a death sentence. Men fought for the title of emperor not because it offered power. By this point, power was an illusion, but because being the one giving orders was slightly safer than being the one receiving them. The question worth asking is why? Why would the men who benefited most from the Roman system keep destroying it? Why would generals who depended on the empire for their rank, their income, and their survival keep assassinating the leaders who held it together? The answer is not complicated. Short-term survival instinct overwhelms long-term system thinking. If you are a Roman general in 250 AD, your choice is not between a stable empire and an unstable one. Your choice is between moving first and being moved against, between reaching for power now or waiting for someone else to take it and eliminate you in the process. This was Rome in 250 AD, a system eating itself alive, and there was one man who saw it clearly enough to try to stop it.
In 284 AD, one man tried to stop the collapse. His name was Diocletian. He was a soldier, the son of a freed slave, who had risen through the ranks to become emperor through the same violence that had consumed his predecessors. But Diocletian did something different. Instead of simply holding power, he tried to redesign the system. He split the empire into two halves, east and west, each with its own emperor and its own administration. He reformed the currency, standardized prices, rebuilt the military structure, and reorganized the tax system. For the first time in decades, the empire functioned. He didn't save Rome, he built a better machine to run on the same broken foundation. Diocletian abdicated in 305 AD, the only Roman emperor in centuries to do so voluntarily. Within 20 years of his retirement, the system he had rebuilt was fracturing again. His reforms had treated the symptoms. The foundation, a currency with no real value, and a political class with no long-term loyalty, remained exactly as broken as before. By the time Germanic tribes began crossing the Rhine in significant numbers in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, Rome had no coherent response, not because the army was too small, not because the borders were too long, but because no one could agree on who was in charge, what they were defending, or whether it was worth defending at all. The barbarians didn't break Rome's door down. They walked through a door that had been left open for a century. Two forces brought Rome down. The first was economic, a currency so debased it was worthless, a tax system so broken it starved the state that depended on it. The second was political, a leadership class that prioritized its own short-term survival over the long-term stability of the system it was supposed to protect. Neither of these forces is unique to Rome. They appear, in different forms, under different names, in every empire that has ever collapsed. The timeline is always different. The mechanism is always the same. It starts on the inside. It starts quietly. It starts long before anyone outside the walls has any idea that something is wrong. Rome took 200 years to fall from the inside. Most people living through it had no idea it was happening. The question worth asking is, how would you know if you were living through the same thing?